Burkhard. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to make a contribution, and also for the very generous hospitality they've shown to me and my wife. I'm an economist, mainly working on social protection systems, all the different branches. But as an important sub-theme, I've been working on the economics of the family, population economics, for more than 2 decades now. So being invited to come here, I could have talked about several things, older projects, current ideas. I decided to do just one thing, to push one idea, an economic concept, and to try to tell you that children are an investment, that categorizing them, analyzing them in these terms, is fruitful, at least partly fruitful, but says something important about the family, and may also say something about what works and what doesn't work in the interaction between families and society, or more precisely, between families and the state. So children are an investment with a broad array of returns, so that we can speak of societal returns. The structure of the talk, very briefly, I need to say something about the conceptual framework, and then I'll discuss several types of returns accruing to different parties, to children and parents first of all, but then also to the economy, to the state, and to society at large. And then I'll briefly touch on the issue, and this is where economics is really important, how public support for families, something that the state does for families, compares to the returns to the public budget. And I'll try to, in fact, just mention a result that I've calculated for Germany, that there are very high net benefits for society, but effectively net burdens for families, and this may, tell us something about the current situation, and then a few conclusions. Okay, the conceptual framework. The economic perspective on families is, I always say that, is narrow. It leaves out many things that are also important, but rather focused. So having a child has aspects that are pure biology, others that are strongly emotional, and economics as a discipline does not have a grip on these kinds of aspects. But having children and bringing them up also involves numerous decisions on, how to utilize your time, how to manage your work career, how to deal with tight budgets, etc. Children are really costly in many terms, so in terms of time and money essentially, and this is where the economists come in. Doing research on families is certainly a multidisciplinary issue, but economists should be in the team when looking at families, and I'll confine my contribution now to what I'm trained to do, to the economic point of view. Some 50 years ago, in the 1960s, economists started something which is called new home economics. Until then, economists had taken private households largely to be a black box. And at that time, economists started looking at the internal structure of households, analyzing relationships between partners, men and women, looking at, the interaction between parents and children, and then trying to rearrange the economy as a whole around this entity, the family, the private household. It's not precisely the same, but most of the time there are huge overlaps. I'd say that looking at children in terms of investment is new home economics 2.0, because in the early years, children were essentially considered a consumption good of parents. Strange idea probably, but parents expend resources on children to buy something, the satisfaction of having children, etc. What few people, and I was certainly not the first one, what few economists until today tried to push as an additional idea is that children are investment good. Probably no longer so much from the perspective of parents, but this is where it all starts. And as I said, I tried to demonstrate that this idea is valuable, is powerful in analyzing the role of families in modern societies. I once wrote a paper where I pushed the analogy between families and small enterprises. So the way they reacted to modernization, globalization, has many common characteristics. So using modern technology, less manual work, downsizing, outsourcing activities, all this happened with large-scale enterprises and with small families. Families are different from enterprises in what they are precisely doing. They interact with the rest of the economy, they act as consumers, as workers, as managers, etc. This is where they interact with the rest of the economy, but their internal process is a bit different. They provide commodities that the market cannot provide. And this is why they still exist and did not dissolve. In turn, they need support when markets fail. There are instances of market failure to the disadvantage of families, and this is where the state would be needed. Unfortunately, there's also policy failure. So state intervention always is not perfect, curing market failure. It sometimes does the wrong things, and that might be bad news for families where it happens in the sphere where policies interact with families. Okay, so far the general background, now more focused on the idea that, well, children are an investment. Why is that the case? Raising children is clearly one of the core competences of a family. I mean, raising children defines a family. Family involves children, multi-generation context. Until they have children, two people are just a couple, and that's it, they're not a family. And then what's involved in this process? Parents spend considerable time and income on their children. Wherever calculations have been made on costs of a child until it becomes, well, aged 18, things like that, you end up with total costs amounting to the price of a huge apartment or small house, several €100,000, depending on, well, opportunity costs, income foregone through using your time to take care of your children. There are direct costs, children need to be fed, clothed, etc. So considerable inputs, costs, and they combine this. That's a parental decision mostly, but sometimes you have public rules stipulating certain activities like bringing children to school, etc. Parents combine their own efforts with public inputs, of their choice mostly, and whether it's public coercion, it's mostly meaningful. So bringing children to school, certainly a good idea. When this became a public mandate in the 1800s. And why are they doing this? They promote something, the well-being of children over their entire life cycle, over the entire life cycle of children. So you want to have children who are well-fed, who have good manners, etc., as long as they're at home. But what parents are interested in is that their children can act as independent actors later on, that they can lead a life course of their own. And this extremely long-term perspective, much longer than most investment time horizons are, that's really important. And they also create positive returns on several other levels, which is what I will try to explain next. But this is basically the typical structure of investment process. High costs up front and returns, massive returns later on, not only in this case for parents, but at other levels as well. Okay, now the returns. Who benefits and how? This is very sketchy and rough, of course. I try to confine my talk to about a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes. Maybe we'll be able to have a discussion later on, so I'll try to explain what's been missing here, if needed. The first beneficiaries of parental investment, I think, are of course the children themselves. Yeah? Their capabilities that they take away, their opportunities they can utilize during the rest of their life. They convert this into income and well-being, become independent, lead a life of their own, create own families if they want to, etc. They are the first and foremost beneficiaries. There are also returns to parents. Economists do not assume parents to be altruistic, or they acknowledge that, I guess, all parents are in one or another way a bit altruistic, but they expect that the whole thing would go through, that the model would work if parents were not altruistic. So it's not a requirement, it's nice if parents are a bit altruistic and do not make a quid pro quo relationship of what they do with their children. But parents have an enormous return in deriving satisfaction from this. And in former times, there were other returns, often even financial returns. So children could contribute to the family income, which, when children had to attend school and child labor was prohibited, for very good reasons, I guess, was no longer an issue. Also, until more recently, children were the most important source of old age income, old age support, which nowadays is no longer relevant, or less relevant in many regards, because there is public provision in this regard, there's public pension schemes, etc. Then the economy benefits, economy meaning enterprises, other consumers, because children are, well, future workers, they guarantee employment, production, and consumption, and all this can fit together in 30 or 40 years from now in a new economic cycle of producing goods, utilizing them to the benefit of everyone involved. Then there is the state as another important agent or actor. And the most important thing here is children are sources of future net revenues to fund for public activities in virtually all areas where public activity is needed. So having children, having enough children, is a basis for fiscal sustainability. And then a fifth, very huge, very important field, which is, again, partly outside the realm of economic analysis, advantages to society. Having children, bringing them up, does important things in terms of the preservation of what economists call social capital, and in essence that is bringing up children to follow norms, formal and informal norms that guarantee social cohesion, the stability of society, and also cultural heritage. Most importantly, language and all that language carries with it. So access to common oral history, to arts, to literature, etc. This is the service or important aspects of what families, what raising children to society at large, as distinct from the other levels I've already been discussing. Now the economics realm, that's mostly levels 3 and 4, 1 and 2, is being looked at in what I call new home economics, with some weaknesses, some things that we leave out because we cannot deal with them, while 5 is a bit outside our focus. Then you'd have to ask, well, everyone involved in analyzing society, sociologists, demographers, etc., those studying literature, music, etc. So this is really other fields. Now, okay, these are many returns, and now comes a bit of basic economics, microeconomics, that might be helpful in understanding why this is not just a nice story about a costly investment with many returns to many parties. To understand why there are problems, potential problems, and I think actual problems in this investment process. Returns number 1 and 2, those accruing to children themselves and parents, are what economists call internal. It's something between contracting parties. And as I said, it may not be a balanced relationship where children exactly give back what they receive from their parents. And this may not be afforded, it would be afforded everywhere, but maybe not in intra-family relationships. But it is internal between the two parties involved, and it creates individual motives for having children, which is why the process is continued. Return number 3, that what happens to the economy. Future employment, production, consumption. That's definitely an internal affair. All relevant services and goods are basically paid for. This creates a typical win-win situation that economists mostly think to exist, where economic interactions are the right way to interact. So these are various returns everywhere. Sounds like good news. The problem, oh, this was too fast, is the following. Returns number 4 and number 5. So the advantages for the state and for the rest of society are what economists call external effects. They fall on somebody else. They are, in a sense, not rewarded, not compensated. And this results in opportunities to free ride on other people's decisions, other people's investment in children. And this might explain important parts of problems with fertility policies, family policies in advanced countries. To make more clear what I think, I'll now move to an extreme phenomenon that is relatively widespread among families today. So the question here, it's a bit provocative. If returns to children are so widespread, why are so many families at poverty risk by the quasi-official standards we're using? They might not be fully appropriate, they might even underestimate. But poverty, of course, as I said, is the extreme most visible form of economic stress for families. In fact, the situation is that if you bring up 2 or more children, 3 or more children, then financial constraints can become very tight even for middle-class families. That's not poverty, but it's a strained and stressed situation. So 2 answers to that. First, families are not poor. They just need means for financing for profitable investment. Investment that's profitable for the family later on, or profitable for everybody else. And to finance for this in the early stage of an investment, you always need, well, some money that firms, that enterprises can lend from banks, can lend from the market. While the type of investment that children are does not allow for this situation. So families are credit constrained, they don't need support against poverty, they need means to finance a profitable investment, which is where the state would come in, to relax the credit constraints, to co-finance important things like education, etc., that families alone cannot pay for. And to the extent that the state steps in and does some co-financing, of course, it might also be entitled to extract some of the returns. Yeah, it's co-financing of investment, and as with a bank credit, this credit needs to be repaid later on, and in one way or another, if the state invests in public schooling, public higher education, he would be entitled to take away some of the returns, to tax the income of these children, etc. So this is a case for well-designed policy intervention. In fields like education, family taxation would be a prime field where this plays a role, policy supporting work-life balance and all these kinds of things. And the second answer I have to the slightly provocative question, well, families are in fact exploited in most existing policy arrangements, since considerable returns, much more than the co-financing of the state would allow for, are taken away from families, taken away from children, and diverted to many other purposes and to other players. So this is then a result of ill-designed policies. And this is very important in fields like public old age protection, public health insurance, etc. In this regard, countries certainly differ a lot. Policy packages are very diverse. Even European countries have huge diversities in the types of policy packages they have in all the areas mentioned here. Old age provision, public health insurance, but also family taxation, public education, policies promoting work-family balance, etc. So the country I come from, Germany, which is, as you probably learned today, is one of the worst cases in terms of low fertility for a very long time, etc., prospects for future population structure, etc. This is an issue, the ill-designed policies, the heavy weight of social protection systems where families are in fact exploited, where this is a particularly important theme. The design of an ideal system that would be well-designed and not ill-designed, by which family are publicly supported, is a very subtle thing. Yeah? The idea is families are supported when children are small, and later on these children rightly have to pay contributions to, in fact, give back what they benefited from. I once wrote a dissertation where I first explored these kinds of things, and there I thought about creating links between public education and financing of public education and public pension entitlements, etc. So this would have been a very subtle arrangement that public policies actually are not really interested in, as I learned later on when I left the purely academic sphere and started policy advising on these issues. In any case, probably we don't need very subtle solutions. If we just look at rough aggregate figures, then we can see when something goes wrong. In any case, when properly compared, and that's an issue in itself, and I won't discuss that here very long, the net balance of what the state pays for an average child and what the state extracts from the life course of an average child should be close to zero. Yeah, that would be fair. And in actual systems, this is often not the case. This is something I've been looking at very intensely for Germany in far rougher terms in other countries. I've been cooperating on these issues with colleagues from Italy and Japan, two other countries which are hit by very low fertility for a relatively long time. So I cannot say it with the same accuracy for all countries. But actual systems are highly skewed, imposing a net burden on children, which means on families. And this is what I call the external effects. It's the visible effect that you, if you really assess things, find a huge gap between what the state pays for and what it extracts from families. That's exploitation, as I said. And in Germany, to give you just a figure, earlier this year I published a study where I checked all this in much detail, updating earlier calculations, improving on the way I model all the important things. I found that there is a net gap in the total interactions between an average child and the public coffers, the public budget, of 100,000 euro in net present value terms the day the child is born. So this is a huge mercy dispense that families give to the state whenever they have a child. And this includes everything that the state, and the German state nowadays pays a lot for families. There is child benefit, there is public schooling, there are extra benefits for the first 2 years, other benefits which matter later on. All this is taken into account here compared to, well, what the child pays back in terms of income taxes, consumption taxes, and most importantly, social security contributions. The net balance, as I said, around 100,000. The accuracy of saying it's 103,000 is a bit overblown, but the basic story is this. And this, of course, this is not specifically true for large families. This multiplies in the number of children. So a family with 4 children would, on net, transfer 400,000 euro to the public budgets by rearing 4 children. What are the main drivers of this imbalance? I already mentioned a few of them. Well, parents, in fact, still bear substantial parts of the investment in children. I don't want to elaborate on that. Child costs, I guess, are probably not in economics terms, but for most of you who are practitioners who do have children, they are relatively familiar, highly familiar, so they still bear a substantial part of the total investment cost. State support, as I said, may be sizable. It's definitely sizable in Germany nowadays as a late response to low fertility, a late response which doesn't help much so far. But still it falls short with a huge gap, a visible gap, of the returns accruing to public budgets later on. Yeah, so the gap, as I said, in Germany is 100,000 euro. If in other countries it's only 40,000 or 60,000, that might be bad news as well. And the main drivers are unfunded systems of social protection. In Germany, most of all, the public pension scheme. If you still remember the picture you've seen about the demographic structure of Germany today or 2025, you get an idea of why this is the case. And the German public pension scheme once was rather generous. Now with the new demographic structure that is emerging, it can no longer be generous, but still has to raise sizable contributions. Current contribution rates are around 20% of monthly earnings, and these contribution rates will go up considerably over the next 15 to 20 years. Plus there is public health insurance, which is also unfunded, and there is public debt, which is an issue in Germany in spite of the recent relatively good performance relative to other countries which were hit much harder by the recent crisis. Our level of public debt in relationship to the current GDP is too high as it is anywhere, maybe not as high as in some other countries.